I was getting ready for the most important meeting of my career when I realized the zipper of my dress was stuck. Frustrated, I called for help, never expecting who would step in, my stepfather. As his hands brushed against my back, a chill ran through me. What should have been a simple gesture suddenly felt too close, too intimate. And that's when everything started to spiral out of control. My name is Emily, and I'm 27 years old. I've always been driven, career-focused, and fiercely independent, traits I inherited from my mother, Diane. She raised me single-handedly after my dad left us when I was a child. Mom is my rock, my confidant, and the woman I've admired most my entire life. A few years ago, she met Michael, a charming, self-assured man in his early 50s. They met at a charity gala, and he swept her off her feet. For the first time, I saw my mom genuinely happy, laughing like a young girl again. I wanted to be happy for her, and for the most part, I was. But there was always this nagging feeling I couldn't quite explain whenever Michael was around. Michael seemed like the perfect husband, kind, attentive, and endlessly patient. He was everything Mom had ever wanted. At first, I admired him too. He was the kind of person who lit up a room the moment he walked in, commanding attention with his effortless charm and warm smile. I thought he was the missing piece in my mom's life, a man who completed her in ways my father never could. But as time passed, things felt different. I couldn't pinpoint it, but there was a subtle tension in the air whenever Michael and I were alone. A fleeting glance here, a lingering moment there. I told myself I was imagining it, brushing off these feelings as paranoia. After all, this was the man my mom loved. There couldn't be anything to it. Still, I couldn't deny how my stomach twisted whenever he complimented me, or how his gaze seemed to linger a moment too long. I started to avoid him, retreating to my room whenever he was around. I tried to push the unease out of my mind, focusing instead on my busy work schedule and plans for the future. My life was full, late nights at the office, dinners with friends, and early mornings chasing my dreams. But that one morning changed everything. What began as a normal day, a hurried search for the perfect outfit and a broken zipper, set off a chain of events I never could have anticipated. That's when the life I thought I knew began to crumble. It started innocently enough, or at least that's what I told myself. After the morning incident with Michael helping me with my zipper, I tried to shake off the strange feeling it left behind. But no matter how much I told myself it was nothing, I couldn't escape the way his hands lingered on my back or how his voice seemed to carry an undertone I hadn't noticed before. I convinced myself it was just a misinterpretation, a fleeting moment of awkwardness. Yet every time I replayed it in my head, it felt more significant, more weighted. That day, I avoided him completely. At dinner, I barely spoke, excusing myself as soon as I could. Mom noticed, of course, but I blamed work stress and retreated to my room. The tension only grew in the days that followed. Michael seemed to find excuses to cross paths with me. He'd knock on my door, asking about mundane things like whether I'd seen his car keys or if I wanted coffee from the kitchen. His gaze felt heavier, his presence harder to ignore. I kept telling myself it was all in my head, that I was overthinking everything. But deep down, I couldn't shake the unease that clung to me like a shadow. One evening, I came home late after a work meeting. The house was dark except for a soft light coming from the kitchen. As I tiptoed in, trying not to wake anyone, I saw Michael sitting at the counter, nursing a glass of wine. He looked up as I entered, his eyes locking onto mine in a way that made me freeze. "Late night?" he asked, his voice low and almost intimate. I nodded, muttering something about work. I planned to grab a glass of water and retreat, but before I could, he gestured to the chair beside him. "Sit for a moment," he said. "You're always rushing off." I hesitated but didn't want to seem rude, so I sat down, keeping my distance. The conversation started innocently enough, work, life, mundane things. But the way he looked at me, the subtle pauses in his words, made my heart race for reasons I didn't understand. "I hope I didn't make you uncomfortable the other morning," he said suddenly, breaking the casual flow of our talk. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. I forced a smile, shaking my head. "No, it's fine. Really." He studied me for a moment, his eyes searching mine. "Good," he said, his tone softer now. "You can always talk to me, you know. About anything." The way he said it felt too personal, too charged. I excused myself as quickly as I could, but the unease lingered long after I closed my bedroom door. Over the next few days, I started noticing things I hadn't before. The way his compliments seemed to go beyond casual flattery. The way he always seemed to be around when I was home, even when he didn't need to be. I tried to ignore it, to act like everything was normal, but the tension was impossible to ignore. Then one night, I overheard a conversation between Michael and my mom. They were in the living room, and I was just passing by when I heard my name. "She seems distant lately," Michael said. "I just want to make sure she's okay." "She's probably just stressed," Mom replied. "Work has been a lot for her." Michael sighed. "I just hope she knows she can trust me. I want to help her if she's struggling." Hearing him talk about me like that, with such concern in his voice, only made things more confusing. Was I imagining everything? Or was there something more to his words, to his lingering glances, to the way my heart raced whenever he was near? I didn't know the answers, but I knew one thing. Something had shifted between us, and it was only a matter of time before it all came to the surface. The tension between Michael and me reached a point where it felt impossible to ignore. Every interaction, every glance seemed to carry an unspoken weight. I kept trying to convince myself it was all in my head, but the more I tried to rationalize, the more I found myself drawn into a confusing web of emotions. One evening, Mom had a late meeting and wouldn't be home until midnight. I came home from work exhausted and found Michael in the living room, watching a documentary with a glass of wine in hand. I had planned to head straight to my room, but as I passed by he called out, "Emily, why don't you join me? It's been a while since we've spent time together." I hesitated, but he gestured to the empty seat on the couch, his smile warm and inviting. Telling myself it was harmless, I sat down, keeping a comfortable distance between us. We watched in silence for a while, the only sounds coming from the television. But I could feel his presence, every shift, every breath. Eventually he spoke, his voice low. "You've seemed a little off lately. Is everything okay?" I forced a smile, nodding. "Work's just been stressful, that's all." "You work so hard," he said, his gaze lingering on me. "You remind me of your mom in that way. She's always been so driven." There was something in the way he said it, a softness that made my stomach flutter. I felt heat rising in my cheeks, and I quickly looked away, pretending to focus on the screen. The conversation shifted to lighter topics: music, travel, memories from his younger days. His stories were engaging, and I found myself laughing despite the tension I felt inside. For a moment it felt normal, easy. But then, as the conversation lulled, I felt his hand graze mine as he reached for his wine glass. It was such a small touch, but it sent a jolt through me. I froze, my heart racing. He didn't pull away immediately, and when I finally looked at him, his eyes were on me, filled with an intensity one couldn't ignore. "Emily," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I hope you know how much you mean to this family." The way he said it made my chest tighten. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught in my throat. He shifted closer, and I could feel the heat of his body next to mine. My pulse quickened as a storm of emotions swirled inside me. Fear, confusion, and something I didn't want to name. Before I could process what was happening, Michael reached up and brushed a strand of hair from my face. His touch was gentle, lingering. "You're incredible, you know that?" he murmured. I felt my breath hitch. "Michael, this is..." I trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. My head was spinning, and all I could hear was the pounding of my heart. He pulled back slightly, his expression conflicted. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." But I didn't move. I didn't say a word. And in that silence, something shifted between us. A fragile, unspoken acknowledgement of the tension we both felt but couldn't admit. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I replayed the moment on the couch. The way his hand brushed mine, the way he looked at me, it all felt wrong, but it also stirred something I couldn't ignore. I told myself it was nothing, that it didn't mean anything. But the truth was I couldn't stop thinking about it. The days that followed only made things more complicated. Michael and I began to have more of these fleeting, charged moments, passing each other in the hallway, catching each other's gaze at the dinner table, brushing hands as we reached for the same object. Each interaction left me feeling breathless and confused, caught in a whirlwind of emotions I didn't understand. One evening, after everyone else had gone to bed, I found myself in the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of water. The house was silent, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator. Suddenly, I heard the soft creak of the floorboards behind me. I turned, and there was Michael, standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice quiet. I shook my head, unable to meet his gaze. He walked into the room, his movements slow and deliberate, and leaned against the counter beside me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with unspoken words and emotions. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost a whisper. "Emily, I don't know what's happening between us, but I can't stop thinking about you." His words hit me like a lightning bolt. I turned to look at him, my eyes wide with shock. "Michael, we can't," I started, but he stepped closer, his expression both pained and vulnerable. "I know," he said, "but I can't help it." I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes as I grappled with the storm inside me. I wanted to run, to escape the feelings threatening to consume me. But I couldn't move. I was frozen, caught in the pull of something I knew I shouldn't feel but couldn't deny. It was late one Friday night when everything unraveled. My mom was away for a weekend retreat with her friends, leaving Michael and me alone in the house. I had spent the day avoiding him, immersing myself in work to keep my mind occupied. But as the evening crept in, the air grew heavier, and I could feel the tension simmering beneath the surface. I decided to distract myself by cleaning the kitchen, hoping the mindless activity would drown out my thoughts. As I wiped down the counters, I heard Michael's voice behind me, soft but steady. "You don't have to do that, you know. It's already spotless." I turned to find him leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed. He wasn't smiling, and there was an intensity in his eyes that made my stomach twist. I forced a laugh, trying to defuse the moment. "I needed something to keep me busy," I said. He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "Emily," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to talk." My heart started pounding, and I instinctively backed away, my hand gripping the counter for support. "Michael, please," I said, my voice shaking. "Don't." But he didn't stop. He stood in front of me now, so close I could feel the warmth radiating from him. "I can't pretend anymore," he said, his eyes locked on mine. "I've tried, but I can't." Tears welled up in my eyes as I shook my head. "This isn't right," I whispered. "You're married to my mom. We can't." "I know," he interrupted, his voice breaking. "But I can't stop feeling this way." The air between us felt charged, like the room was holding its breath. My mind screamed at me to run, to end this before it went too far, but my body wouldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in the intensity of the moment. Then, in one swift motion, he closed the distance between us. His hand brushed against my cheek, and I flinched but didn't pull away. His touch was soft, tentative, and it sent a jolt through me. "Tell me you don't feel it too," he said, his voice trembling. "Tell me and I'll stop." I opened my mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, a single tear slid down my cheek, betraying the turmoil inside me. His thumb gently wiped it away, and in that moment, the walls I had carefully built around my emotions came crashing down. Before I knew it, his lips were on mine, hesitant at first, but growing more certain as I didn't pull away. The kiss was electric, a chaotic blend of passion, fear, and desperation. It felt like everything and nothing all at once, and I was powerless to stop it. When we finally pulled apart, reality hit me like a freight train. I stumbled back, my hands covering my face. "What are we doing?" I cried. "This is wrong. So wrong." Michael looked just as shaken, his face pale and his eyes filled with regret. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking. "I don't know what came over me." I turned away, unable to look at him. "We can't let this happen again," I said firmly, though my voice wavered. "It has to stop here." He nodded, his shoulders slumping. "You're right. It won't happen again." But as I fled to my room, the taste of his kiss still lingering on my lips, I knew it wasn't that simple. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. The next day, I avoided him completely. I stayed in my room, only coming out when I was sure he wasn't around. But the weight of what had happened hung over me like a storm cloud, suffocating and inescapable. Then that evening, the unthinkable happened. I had just stepped out of the shower when I heard raised voices coming from downstairs. My heart sank as I recognized my mom's voice. She had come home early. I wrapped myself in a towel and crept to the top of the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. Mom and Michael were arguing, their voices echoing through the house. "What are you hiding, Michael?" Mom demanded. "You've been acting strange for weeks. Don't think I haven't noticed." "I'm not hiding anything," he replied, his voice defensive. "You're imagining things." "Don't lie to me," she shouted. "I saw the way you looked at her." My blood turned to ice. She knew. Somehow she knew. "I don't know what you're talking about," Michael said, his voice wavering. "Emily is your daughter." "I would never." "Don't lie to me." Mom screamed, her voice breaking. "I'm not blind, Michael. I've seen the way you act around her. Just admit it." There was a long, painful silence, and then Michael said something I would never forget. "It's not what you think," he said quietly. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. My legs gave way, and I sank to the floor, my hands trembling. Mom's sobs echoed through the house, and I knew everything was falling apart. Mom stormed out of the house moments later, slamming the door behind her. Michael didn't follow. Instead, he sank onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. I stayed frozen at the top of the stairs, my mind racing. When he finally looked up, his eyes met mine. Neither of us said a word, but the look on his face said it all: regret, shame, and an unspoken apology. I turned and fled to my room, locking the door behind me. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The weight of what had happened was suffocating, and I couldn't escape the guilt and shame that consumed me. Everything was ruined: my relationship with my mom, the life we had built together, and any semblance of normalcy. I knew there was no going back, no way to undo what had been done. And as I lay there, tears streaming down my face, I realized this was only the beginning of the fallout. The morning after my mom's discovery was unbearably quiet. The silence in the house was suffocating, every creak of the floorboards and rustle of movement amplified like thunder. I stayed in my room, afraid to face what lay beyond the door. My heart was heavy, my mind a whirlwind of regret, shame, and confusion. Mom didn't come home that night, and when I finally emerged the next morning, Michael was sitting at the kitchen table, his face buried in his hands. His usually composed demeanor was shattered, replaced with an expression of utter defeat. "Emily," he said, his voice hoarse as he looked up. "We need to talk." I hesitated, my stomach churning with dread. "Where's Mom?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "She went to stay with a friend," he replied, his tone flat. She needs some time to process everything." I felt a pang of guilt so sharp it was almost physical. "Michael, No," he interrupted, shaking his head. "This isn't your fault. It's mine. I let things get out of control." I wanted to believe him, but deep down, I knew we were both responsible. We had crossed a line that never should have been crossed, and now we were paying the price. The next few days were a blur of avoidance and tension. Mom still hadn't returned, and Michael and I barely spoke. The house felt like a tomb, filled with the echoes of what had been and the weight of what could never be undone. One evening, I found myself sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at my phone. I wanted to call my mom, to beg for her forgiveness, but I didn't know where to start. What could I possibly say to make this right? Eventually, I mustered the courage to dial her number. The phone rang endlessly before going to voicemail. I tried again, but she didn't answer. My chest tightened as I left a message, my voice cracking. "Mom, it's me. Please just call me back. I'm so sorry." The days turned into a week, and the weight of her silence was unbearable. When she finally returned home, her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. She didn't say a word to me as she walked through the door, her movements stiff and deliberate. "Mom, can we talk?" I asked hesitantly, following her into the living room. She turned to me, her expression a mixture of pain and anger. "Talk about what, Emily? How you betrayed me? How you let this happen?" Her words cut through me like a knife. "I never meant for this to happen," I said, tears streaming down my face. "It wasn't supposed to." "Stop," she said sharply, holding up her hand. "I don't want to hear excuses. You knew what you were doing. Both of you did." I stood there, frozen, as she sank into the couch, her shoulders trembling. "You were my daughter," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I trusted you. I trusted him. And now everything is ruined." Her words crushed me, and I dropped to my knees in front of her. "Mom, please," I begged. "I'll do anything to make this right." She looked at me, her eyes filled with a pain I had never seen before. "You can't make this right, Emily," she said softly. "Some things can't be undone." Michael walked in at that moment, and the tension in the room became unbearable. Mom's gaze shifted to him, and the fury in her eyes was palpable. "I want you out," she said coldly. "Pack your things and leave. Now." Michael didn't argue. He simply nodded, his face a mask of regret. As he walked past me to head upstairs, our eyes met briefly, and I saw the weight of everything we had done reflected in his gaze. That night, I listened as he packed his belongings and left the house for good. The sound of the door closing behind him felt like the final nail in the coffin of the life we once had. In the days that followed, Mom and I barely spoke. She avoided me whenever she could, and when we did cross paths, her words were clipped and distant. The warmth and closeness we had shared were gone, replaced by an icy wall I couldn't break through. I spent countless nights lying awake, replaying everything in my head. The moments with Michael, the decisions I had made, the pain I had caused, it all haunted me. I wanted to turn back time, to undo everything, but I knew it was impossible. The guilt and shame were overwhelming, and I started to withdraw from everything: work, friends, life. I was a shell of myself, weighed down by the consequences of my actions. One evening, as I sat in my room, staring at the red dress that had started it all, I realized I couldn't keep living like this. I needed to face what I had done, to take responsibility and try to make amends, no matter how impossible it seemed. The next morning, I found Mom in the kitchen, sipping her coffee in silence. I took a deep breath and sat down across from her. "Mom," I said, my voice trembling, "I know I've hurt you in ways I can't even begin to understand. But I want to try to fix this. I want to be better, for you, for us." She looked at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she sighed and set her cup down. "Emily, I don't know if I can ever forgive you," she said. "But if you're serious about making things right, you have a long way to go." Her words gave me a glimmer of hope, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of light in the darkness. I didn't know if we could ever truly heal, but I was willing to try. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of my life. Mom and I barely spoke, but the silence wasn't as cold as it had been before. It was the kind of silence that felt like a pause, a space to process, to heal, to figure out what could come next. Michael was gone, and with him, the unbearable tension that had consumed our home. But his absence also left a gaping hole, a reminder of the betrayal that had shattered everything. I threw myself into therapy, hoping to untangle the mess of emotions that had led me down this path. My therapist, a kind and patient woman named Dr. Harris, helped me peel back the layers of guilt and confusion. She didn't let me shy away from the hard questions. Why did I let it happen? What was I searching for in Michael's attention? And most importantly, how could I begin to rebuild the relationship with my mother? Through those sessions, I started to understand myself in a way I never had before. I realized how much I had craved validation, how I had confused admiration with something deeper. I began to see how the unresolved wounds from my father's abandonment had left me vulnerable, always seeking approval in the wrong places. One evening, after weeks of avoidance, Mom and I finally sat down to talk. It was late, and the house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I had spent days rehearsing what I wanted to say, but as I sat across from her at the kitchen table, all the words I had prepared seemed inadequate. "Mom," I began, my voice shaky, "I don't know how to start, but I need you to know how sorry I am. I betrayed your trust in the worst way, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life." She didn't say anything, but her eyes glistened with unshed tears. I took a deep breath and continued. "I don't expect you to forgive me. Not now, maybe not ever. But I want to try to make it right. I want to prove to you that I'm still your daughter, that I can be better." Her lips quivered as she spoke. "Emily, what you did, it broke me. It broke everything I thought I knew about our family. But," she paused, wiping a tear from her cheek, "you're still my daughter. I can't just stop loving you, even if it hurts." Her words broke the dam inside me, and I started to cry, the weight of everything finally spilling out. We sat there for hours, talking, crying, and slowly peeling back the layers of hurt. It wasn't a magical fix, but it was a start. As time passed, our relationship began to mend, piece by fragile piece. We took small steps, sharing meals, going for walks, watching movies together. It wasn't the same as before, but there was a new honesty between us, a rawness that made every moment feel more real. I also worked to rebuild my own sense of self. I focused on my career, rekindled old friendships, and found healthier ways to seek connection. It was a long and painful journey, but it taught me lessons I would carry for the rest of my life. From this experience, I learned that betrayal doesn't just hurt others, it destroys pieces of yourself. Trust, once broken, is almost impossible to repair, and the scars it leaves are permanent. But I also learned that growth can come from even the most devastating mistakes. It requires humility, accountability, and the willingness to face the darkest parts of yourself. My relationship with my mom will never be what it was before, but it has become something new, something stronger in its own way. And as for Michael, he remains a ghost of a chapter one will never revisit, a painful reminder of the lines I should never have crossed. Now, every day, I remind myself of the person I want to be. Someone who values trust, who chooses integrity over temptation, and who never takes love for granted again. If you were in Emily's shoes, what would you have done differently? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to like this video if it resonated with you, and subscribe to my channel for more stories that dive into the complexities of love, trust, and betrayal. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.